Hello again. I have, of course, spoken before about the deeply weird idea of assuming responsibility for the actions of one's ancestors. A mad concept which nobody in the modern world dares to question for fear of being accused of being a heartless racist. Most ordinary people recognise it as being a loopy idea, but then nobody really asks ordinary people what they think about things, unless there's an election in the offing. In the description to this video, I give a link to a newspaper article about a bunch of wealthy families who are volunteering to send money to the West Indies as reparation because 200 years ago and more, members of their families had business dealings with slave plantations. To illustrate just how raving mad this is, and how it is based upon Alice in Wonderland logic, I would like to tell a story about an ancestor of my own. My maternal grandfather. Finley Robert Alexander Robertson was born in 1890, and in 1914 he signed up as a soldier, serving with the colours until he was demobbed in 1919. He died in 1974, almost 50 years ago, so I feel I can safely tell a favourite story of his openly. He fought in most of the great battles, such as Passchendaele and the Somme, and during the German Spring Offensive in 1918 was in the thick of the fighting there. It was a desperate time, and it was thought there was a real chance of the Germans winning the war. While delivering a message from one part of the line to another, he encountered 5 German soldiers who had been cut off from their unit. They decided to surrender to my grandfather. Maybe they'd had enough of the fighting and thought they could then see out the rest of the war safely behind the lines. His duty at this point was to escort the prisoners to the rear and then hand them over to the authorities there. But his mates were in a desperate situation, and my grandfather wished to get back to them so he could assist in defending the line against the German onslaught. For this reason, he didn't wish to waste time trekking back to HQ with these prisoners. On the other hand, nor did he feel able to take the chance of simply freeing them in case they turned out to be saboteurs or spies. He hit upon a brilliantly simple solution to the problem by herding them at gunpoint into a dugout and then throwing a couple of Mills bombs in after them. Hand grenades, that is to say. He thus, in defiance of all the rules of war, killed 5 unarmed prisoners in cold blood. It tells us something about the feelings of people about Germans in the post-war years when I tell you that my grandfather in later life used to tell this anecdote of family get-togethers, and nobody ever showed any surprise or shock. It was just the kind of thing which happened in the Great War, and most people had heard similar stories. I've told this anecdote for a reason. Here is one of my ancestors who did a very bad thing. He murdered 5 people. Those people all had relatives, perhaps wives and children, certainly mothers and sisters. The killing of each of those men had an effect on their families, and it's quite possible that the effects linger on to this day, perhaps in terms of poverty and grief, who knows what. Here is my question. To what extent am I responsible for my grandfather's actions, his crime if you like? What do I owe to the relatives and descendants of the men he wronged so terribly? If I knew that any of the descendants of those men were hard up today, would I have a duty to send them money in reparation for what my grandfather did 115 years ago? Most people would find these questions utterly grotesque, of course. How could I possibly be to blame for what my grandfather did years before I was even born? That's crazy. Over the last few years, though, the idea has gradually grown that it is not mad to assume responsibility for the bad actions of one's ancestors, and that indeed we have a moral duty to accept that we are responsible for what people who lived centuries ago did, if they were related to us, that is. This is the essence of the reparations for slavery business, which is now becoming an unstoppable juggernaut. If I'm not responsible for the wrongdoing of my grandfather, how can it possibly be the case that any of us can be responsible for the actions of men who died 200 years ago? It is completely mad.